To get started, thank you all for coming. My name is Peter Foreman, and I'm I'm president of the Chamber of Commerce. On your tables, we have both index cards and some blue sheets with a brief survey. We would like to do our own economic survey today with all of you who are in attendance. JD will give us his survey, but we'd like to hear from our local businesses as well. So you don't have to identify yourself, but please take one of the blue sheets, fill it out. We will be around to collect them, or you can just leave them on the table and we'll pick them up after. The blank index cards are for questions of our guest speaker. We hope to have some time for some question and answers after JD's presentation. And if you've been to our events in the past, you know that we take written questions, and we'll try to get a few in after that. A couple of programming notes. This is one of 3 chamber events this week. Tomorrow night, we have a business after hours in Kingston hosted by Rogers & Gray Insurance. And then Thursday morning, we have a seminar on creating a social media strategy for your business. And this will be held at the South Shore Vocational Tech High School in Hanover. And you can sign up through our website when you get back. Now, as many of you know, we had planned on an 11:44 lunch a few weeks ago with Senator Markey. Unfortunately, the debt ceiling government shutdown debate forced a change in his schedule. He was sincerely apologetic that he was not able to join us, and we are working on a new time for him to address the chamber, possibly this year. So watch for the emails and our website for that. It will be the Senator's first appearance before the South Shore Chamber, and I know he was quite generous with his time. He gave us 90 minutes during our fly down to Washington a few weeks ago. Today's lunch is a bit of a departure from our typical political lineup of speakers for our breakfasts and lunches. And it's a bit different than our usual economic outlook lunch. Rather than looking at the economy from a state or New England perspective, we're going to be coming at it from a national, perhaps international perspective. And that may look a little different, but the content should feel about the same, since what happens nationally does reflect what we're feeling locally. And along those same lines, our lead partner sponsor for the lunch may also look a little different and feel a bit international, but beneath it, it is still a familiar company that plays an important role for us locally. Some of us remember the old local bank, Sovereign Santander, which disappeared last month. They've completed the transition with their recent rebranding to the parent company name of Santander. It's still the same bank with an international parent, but the focus is still on local markets and customers. And we're pleased that Santander's commitment to local communities has continued with its renewed partnership in the Chamber and its sponsorship of our annual Economic Outlook lunch. I would like to recognize our lead sponsor for this lunch and introduce Santander's Managing Director of Commercial Banking. Please welcome David Paulson.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for commenting on our rebranding. We're thrilled at the bank to have finally wrapped up, after 4 years of being a subsidiary of Santander, finally rebranding and getting all those beautiful signs out there, recognizing our new brand at Santander. So thank you so much for that comment. For those of you, there's a lot of bankers in the room, so everybody knows all the banks, but for those of you that don't know Santander, we're one of the largest, strongest, most well-capitalized banks in the world. And so we're thrilled about that, but more importantly, as Peter alluded to, we're thrilled about the role we play in our local communities, taking care of our clients and being involved with organizations like the South Shore Chamber. Our affiliation with the South Shore Chamber has been long, probably close to 15 years now. And for the past 8 or 9 years, we've been fortunate enough to be the lead sponsor to this Economic Outlook event. You know, some breakfasts, some lunches, and so it's been a great affiliation for us. The South Shore Chamber has always provided thought-provoking ideas, thought-provoking commentary, and a forum to talk about the political universe that we know, the economic environment that we live through. Ironically, Santander's corporate tagline is a bank for your ideas, and so that's what it's all about, right? Just exchanging ideas. And so we're here today as Santander with our longtime partner, the South Shore Chamber, happy to present J.D. Foster, who's going to give his ideas on the state of our economy. So thank you, and thank you, Peter, for everything you and all your colleagues do at the South Shore Chamber. You've just been a great friend to the bank and great for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and you're correct. As a large regional chamber, we have an ambitious agenda, and that agenda wouldn't be possible with the help we get from our volunteers, our partnership group, and some of the local, state, and national partners we work with to build a stronger economy and a stronger South Shore. One of those national groups we work with is the United States Chamber of Commerce. And I'm glad that they were able to provide us J.D., who I had the pleasure of hearing a few months ago. And their Rhode Island regional office has been working very closely with us over the last few years. One of our leading volunteers and leading partners, though, is our own chairman of the board. Please welcome the president of Eastern Bank and our 2013 chamber chairman, Bob Rivers.
Well, thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy calendars to join us here for lunch today. In particular, I wanted to thank all of our directors, presidents, and chairman's partners who make events like this possible. And what an event it is. I know many of you have been to our annual economic breakfast or luncheon, as the case may be, over the years. And I will tell you, just when most of you were probably giving up hope that anyone in Washington understood the economy, we are pleased to bring you someone who understands data and analysis. In fact, what might be even more impressive is that we have a professional economist this time who can put the data into understandable context for us mere mortals. J.D. Foster is the Deputy Chief Economist at the United States Chamber of Commerce. He came to the Chamber earlier this year from the Heritage Foundation, where he was a senior fellow focusing on entitlement reform, tax reform, and the economy. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, he was for 5 years the chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. He had previously served in an earlier White House as chief of staff in the Council of Economic Advisors. Over the course of about 28 years in Washington, he has also worked at the United States Treasury, in the House of Representatives, as well as in the U.S. Senate. He received his Ph.D. from Georgetown in public finance. So quite an impressive background. Please join me in welcoming today J.D. Foster. J.D.
Thank you all. I want to thank South Shore, Peter, and Bob for the invitation, and thank Santander Bank for the opportunity, in particular the opportunity to hear how that's pronounced properly. I've been mispronouncing it all my life, so I've learned something. And thank you all for joining us today. I want to talk a little bit about the macroeconomy, a little bit about Washington, and then open it up for whatever questions that you have. We do have an amazing abundance of economic data in this country. We take it for granted how much data that we get, some of it government, some of it private. This Thursday we get the first read on third quarter GDP. The core of that's probably going to be about the same as it's been for the last few years, around 2%. May bump a little higher because of inventories, but that's no reason to really count your blessings. We may hear at the time that The slow growth was because of the shutdown, and you know immediately that you should not listen to that commentator anymore since the shutdown happened after the end of the third quarter. The fourth quarter, September jobs numbers then come out on Friday. That will be an opportunity for people to crow about the shutdown and its effect on employment, which was actually almost nil, so it really is consistent with what we're seeing in the economy. Despite all of these numbers, let me turn this thing on. There we go. I want to start off with two simple numbers, 4.5 and 2.2. And just hold those for a second as we consider a scenario. You're running a business. You've contracted with a customer to provide some services for $2 million a month. You start providing the services under the contract, the first month goes by. After the first month goes by, your accountant comes up and says, boss, we got a problem. We're only getting paid $1 million. We're supposed to get paid $2 million. The boss says, well, you know, it's early in the contract, and they're having a little cash flow problem, so let's just cut them some slack. This is a big contract. We want to make this work. Okay, fine. Second month goes by, same thing happens. The accountant comes to him and says, we're supposed to get paid $2 million. We're only getting paid $1 million. This is a problem. The boss says, yeah, I have to call him up, and he calls the customer up, and the customer says, we'll try to do better. Third month goes by, same thing. Fourth month goes by, same thing. If you were in that business, there comes a point where you're going to get a little mad. You're going to get frustrated. You're going to think about what you need to do differently with this customer to get paid. Well, that's basically the story of our economic recovery. 4.5 is the rate of growth of normal recoveries in the post-war era for the first 3 years. First 3 years, average growth in our economy in a recovery in the post-war era is 4.5% real GDP growth. 2.2 is what we've had. Now you could understand a slow recovery after a terrible recession, deeply centered on financial markets. You could understand a slow recovery in the first year. You might understand it in the second. By the third year, you start to get a little cranky. And by the fourth year, we should be mad. Instead, we kind of just take it. When I talk to audiences across the country and ask business people, how's things going? For the most part, they'd say, well, it's okay, could be better. And that's sort of the attitude for the overall economy. We're doing okay. We're growing. A lot of places in the world would look at 2.2% and think that's really great. Japan would go crazy. Europe would just love 2.2. But we should be doing much better than 2.2. But that's all we've got. We should be mad about it. We should be demanding answers. One of the answers we should ask is, why are we only going so slowly? And the second is, what's Washington doing or to us or for us to make that happen? This is a big chart of numbers. I won't ask you to read them all, but there's one on the lower right-hand side which shows you the 4.5. That's the average for the recessions. So this chart is sort of the summary where we get that number, showing all the recoveries in the post-war era and the growth rates in the first few years. This is our forecast right now, which is pretty consistent with what everybody else has, about 1.6% growth in real GDP this year, about maybe 2.7 accelerating for next year. Definitely a pickup, but you can see those two red bars, that's not a robust recovery. That's just more of the same. We should be doing much, much better. You see the translation of those numbers in the labor market. The top two charts are the two surveys that we have, the employer survey and the household survey on the labor markets. And you see recovery. You see the recession, you see recovery. But what you also see is now heading towards 4.5 years after the onset of recovery, we are still 2 million jobs, nearly 2 million jobs below the previous peak. That's nothing short of outrageous. We have a high unemployment rate. There's the lower right-hand chart there is the unemployment rates. A lot of people are now focusing on that red one because there's been so much disruption in labor markets, people leaving the labor force, working marginally attached, that the real unemployment rate is probably more like the red one. That's extraordinarily high by historical standards. The lower left-hand chart is initial unemployment claims. Economists who do forecasting and follow the macroeconomy look at this a lot because normally it's one of our best real-time indicators of the state of the economy. See the recession, you see it's come down dramatically. Normally, In our economy, if you see a initial unemployment claims number in the 300s, 320, 325, that indicates either an economy that's growing very, very fast annually or near full employment. We have neither. That chart is telling us a key to what's been going wrong in our economy. Basically what it's saying is employers aren't firing people at unusual levels. We have a big economy, huge workforce. People actually get fired at the rate of 300,000 plus a week normally, but they're not hiring either. So we have this sort of static labor market consistent with a statically growing economy. What you need to understand is economic recovery in a free market system is natural. This is what economies that are flexible do. Businesses see waste, they see opportunity, they have an entrepreneurial spirit, they take the actions necessary to propel the economy forward. Markets heal, businesses heal, the economy recovers. I often use an example of a rubber band. If I were holding a rubber band up here, it would just be sitting up there and be kind of quiet. I start pulling on it, that's like a recession. The rubber band wants to snap back because of the physics in that rubber. And the harder you pull on it, the more it wants to snap back. That's the way an economy works. It wants to recover. Something's holding it back. The forces that drive the recovery are very simple. Prices adjust, you see opportunities, you see profit, you take action, you employ resources, and by employing resources that were unemployed, the economy recovers. That's the norm. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it we have such a slow recovery? And then going forward, what new threats are we going to be facing in 2014 and beyond that this economy is going to have to overcome to continue to grow? This is a chart that captures some of that same idea, but in a more graphical form. The red line is what's called potential GDP over time, from about 1970 forward. Potential here means this is the level of GDP that we would have at full employment without inflating the economy. It's just an estimate. It's not something that you get from the Hubble Spy Telescope, which is a measure of physics. It's just the CBO's best guess. But it captures a couple things that you want to see in that estimate. One is it's steady growth because it grows with the labor supply and productivity, which tend to grow in terms of potentials at a fairly steady rate. And then you have the other line, which is all wiggly, and it captures a couple things. One, you see that the actual GDP tends to follow the red line of potential. And every time you have a recession where it dips below, it catches up. Every time in the past you have the recession, the economy then scrambles to get back to potential, except now. You get towards the end there, what you have is something that looks an awful lot like railroad tracks. The economy is not catching up to its potential. That output gap, again, is just estimate, and the precision doesn't really matter, but it's in the order of 5 to 10% of GDP. That's a huge output gap that's persisting. And if we were to extend that line outwards, most forecasts have it continuing, not catching up for years and years and years. This is not the way flexible economies are supposed to operate. If we were at full employment today, I remember I said that total employment is just under 2 million jobs below the previous peak. If we were at full employment today, according to an analyst at the Brookings Institute, 7 to 8 million jobs. His point estimate is 7.4. Again, these are rough estimates, so roughly speaking, 7 to 8 million Americans would be at work today if we had gotten a normal recovery and we were near at full employment. That's an awful lot of Americans who need an explanation of why the economy is doing so poorly. Not contracting, just not growing rapidly. It's that same potential and actual chart, only focusing more on the near term. Again, these lines should be approaching one another. The lower line should be rising rapidly to the potential, and it's not. And that's not an unusual forecast for the Chamber. That's pretty consistent across most of forecasters. The ingredients of a rapid recovery, again, are pretty simple. A benign policy environment. You don't need government doing things for you to get the economy to grow all the time. Now, the Fed is obviously in an enormously accommodative posture with quantitative easing. We'll come back to that. But otherwise, the best thing for the government to do is less harm. Not do no harm. This is the federal government, after all. less harm will do, thank you. The economy is strong enough to recover without you telling it what to do. A recent study, again by Brookings, came out, I think it was Brookings, that said the Cash for Clunkers program was probably a net harm to the economy. The government desperately wanted to do something. Well, it did. It made things worse. We had the first-time home buyers credit. Housing sector obviously key to the initial recession and recovery, and a key component of healing in the housing sector was price discovery. So we come along with the first-time home buyers credit and foul up what buyers and sellers understand to be the market clearing price in the housing sector. Probably set back the recovery by months, if not a full year. We don't need government doing things so much as just back off for now, let the economy heal. It knows what to do. Entrepreneurs know what to do if you just get out of the way and create the right environment. And they do that because we have flexible labor and capital markets. This flexibility is what allows our economy to adjust, both in good times and in bad. And normally we think of flexible financial markets, we think of the ability to save and be able to borrow money and so forth, but I was reminded this morning of another aspect that may be coming back. It's a hopeful sign. I was watching one of the TV news programs, and they mentioned that there were 16 IPOs scheduled, initial public offerings scheduled. One of the glories of our economy that we have much more than almost anybody else in the world is our willingness to come to the marketplace with new share offerings, but also of businesses to buy and sell elements. We move entire subsidiaries. We spin them off. We buy them. One company transfers to another. We move massive components of our economy to more efficient uses. That's part of that flexibility. The IPO is a sign of health coming back. We still don't see the M&A activity, which is going to be crucial. And I suspect that if you were to ask most of the Fortune 500 CEOs, if there aren't a few divisions in their business that no longer fit their strategy, they would say, oh yeah, we got a lot of it. Well, why don't you get rid of it? The market's not right for that right now. So one of the signs that you will be looking for when the economy finally does take off, and I think it will eventually, is a resumption of normal levels of M&A activity, and it may be an initial burst because there's a lot of backlog that needs to be cleared, businesses carrying subsidiaries and units that they don't want and others that they want to buy. Labor markets is something we're going to come back to. We normally have one of the most flexible labor markets in the world. That's something that Chairman Greenspan, before he was a maestro back in the 90s, made a big deal of in a speech. Flexible labor markets. The willingness of individuals to move from one place to another in our economy is unusual in the world. In China, we're seeing one consequence of that, right? You're seeing the movement of labor from the rural areas to the cities. They call it urbanization there, naturally enough, and that's a big source of their economic growth. Labor movement. In many areas of the world, people do not move. In Europe, for the most part, old Europe, as Secretary Weinberger once referred to them, they don't like to move very much. And so they don't grow as well. We have very flexible labor markets usually. That's been inhibited, and we'll come back to that. And then the entrepreneurial spirit. Americans are inherently entrepreneurial, but so are people around the world. I think the Chinese are entrepreneurial, the Greeks are entrepreneurial. Yes, they are, but you've got to have the other elements. You've got to have the flexibility and the policy environment for that entrepreneurship to play out. So why did we have such a slow recovery? One of the early answers you heard was, well, it was in the financial sector. The analogy I like to use there is, imagine you have an electricity grid and different elements all over the country, you simply shut it off for a period. You may be in the business of producing electricity, that's a problem, but you may be relying on that electricity, and that's a real problem. You have a perfectly healthy business, but you can't get electricity. You have a perfectly healthy business, but you can't get credit for inventory. So that was a legitimate explanation for why the recovery was so slow in the first 12 to 18 months. 4.5 years later, it doesn't really add too much. The retarding effects of policy uncertainty. I'll distinguish here the uncertainty about policy from the policies themselves. You've got a business, you know the federal government is about to come out with some new regulation on labor standards or environmental standards that's going to affect your business. What do? Well, you do nothing. It's called a regulatory freeze. If you don't have to make a decision until you get clarity about what that regulation is going to do and how it will affect your business plans and then move forward, you're going to stand pat. Well, you may have seen the story last week. Since the new labor secretary came in, Secretary Perez, the Labor Department has released more regulations than they've done in years. Just a flood of regulations coming out. There's a flood of regulations coming out on the environment. And it's not just regulation. How about tax policy? For a long time, we didn't know what the tax rates were going to be. We didn't know what Obamacare was going to do. We're now starting to learn something about what Obamacare is going to do. According to a couple of economists at the San Francisco Fed, they estimated, this was about a year ago, so the number's probably larger, but at the time, ballpark, the uncertainty alone about federal policy explained half of the shortfall in our recovery. Whether you think about it, that output gap, it's 10%, 5% of it was for policy uncertainty, that 8 million Americans who should be working, about 4 million are not working because of policy uncertainty. Not the policy, just not knowing what it was going to do. And of course, there's the Fed with its uncertainty. The regulations, well, we have Dodd-Frank. Anyone in the financial sector knows that. Anyone with a large industrial concern knows about Dodd-Frank. A good friend of mine works for a major multinational in the energy business. He is a CPA. He's been working in the CFO's office. He and a team of 20 people have spent the last 2 years trying to figure out how their company operates under Dodd-Frank. Now, wait a minute. Dodd-Frank is about financial regulation. What's an industrial concern in the energy business? Well, there are rules in Dodd-Frank that affect just about everybody. Huge uncertainty about how that's going to work. The ACA regulations and environmental tax policy, so forth. A lot of policy uncertainty. And then there's another aspect that's held us up. Household assets and startups. Where does a startup usually get its capital? Their own assets, family assets, friends' assets. This recession crunched housing values, crunched financial assets, and household balance sheets took a huge hit. Well, that's the seed corn for startups. Without startups, you've lost one of your major sources of economic recovery. Well, household balance sheets are now recovering. Household prices are rising. Housing prices are rising, Financial markets doing pretty well. That inventory of seed corn has been replenished, so we should see more of a pickup in startups. Meanwhile, household liabilities have been held pretty constant. Further sign that the balance sheet of the American household is significantly improved. That's going to be very helpful for going forward, not just for startups, but for a whole lot of things, consumer spending and so forth. So that's one of the bright spots. That's one of the reasons why there's reason now to think that after this long delay, the recovery is finally ready to take off. Well, another thing that happened to us, of course, was the tax hikes that the president insisted on for this year. Higher individual income tax rates, higher taxes on dividends and capital gains, a sneaky new tax on capital through what looks like the payroll tax, higher Medicare tax rate. If you had an economy that was overheating and you didn't think the Fed was acting fast enough to slow it, and you designed a tax increase specifically to slow the economy, this would be a good candidate. We should not be surprised that 2013 has been lackluster. If nothing else was going on, this was probably enough, and the president insisted on it. And then there's this housing prices and labor mobility. This is a critical point that doesn't get enough attention. As I said, flexibility in labor and capital markets is key to the recovery. And if you look at the top two graphs show all the pain in housing, and if you're in construction, you might not want to look at those. The lower left-hand chart is one I want to draw your attention to. Median housing prices. Just one measure, but a perfectly good one for making the point. Median housing prices rose, collapsed during the recession. They've now recovered greatly. The effect of increase in housing prices, what does that have to do with labor? Very simple. Millions of Americans who needed to move, they were out of a job, their employer closed, bad regional economic environment, whatever, were underwater. When housing prices collapsed, millions of Americans were underwater on their mortgage. That means, unless you walk away from the home, you're stuck. We lost a significant component of our normal labor mobility. Precisely those people, for the most part, who most need to move, and they couldn't. Well, from the beginning of the second quarter to the end of the second quarter this year, the percentage of Americans with underwater mortgage dropped by a quarter because of rising housing prices. They've continued to rise since then. So when we get new data, it will show even more Americans. So we're heading towards a normal housing sector, even in terms of Americans being underwater on their mortgage. That's great unto itself for the housing sector and so forth. But from my perspective, what's most important about that is we're regaining one of our key factors for an economic recovery, full labor mobility. So if you see an opportunity, you need to move. Maybe you're in an area in the country where the economy's not doing very well and you want to move to, say, South Shore, which is doing great. Now you can, and this is two-sided. If you're the employer in South Shore who's desperately trying to find someone to fill a job, and you can't because they're not in that workforce, you just can't find them locally, well, that person may be in Ohio and he's desperate to come here, but he can't, he's underwater. Well, he's no longer underwater, now he can move. So it's affecting both sides of the labor market. The willingness of and ability of people to move, and employers' ability to hire, to find people. Areas in the country where the unemployment rate is relatively low, they're dying for employees. They're doing everything they can to find employees. They can't find them. Well, a lot of them are stuck in underwater homes. Not so much anymore, and that's a tremendous source of renewed strength. And one of the reasons I'm hopeful that, in fact, the recovery is about to start to really accelerate. So why this little recovery? These are 5 reasons. There's probably 5 more, but these strike me as being the most important ones for right now. And so a lot of them are retarding. Policy uncertainty is diminishing. We're starting to know what's in a lot of these regulations. We don't like the answers necessarily, but at least we know what they are and we can adjust. That's especially true with Obamacare. We're getting to understand more of what that means. So the uncertainty is diminishing. The household balance sheets are recovered, and housing prices are recovering and getting us our labor mobility. So we're in a position now, finally, for the recovery to begin to accelerate. Don't know how fast that will happen. We've sort of gotten used to it's okay. We were talking earlier, Peter and I were, about how the entrepreneurial spirit has a certain lean forward attitude toward it. And the American entrepreneurs, businesses have gotten so used to worrying, they've become more risk averse. And over time, when they see more opportunities, more people will do it, and you start getting more of that lean forward, we'll get the entrepreneurial spirit back in full, and then I think the recovery would really take off. We will close that output gap. Now think about what that means for a minute. The economy normally grows at, say, 2.5% in real terms every year at full employment. We've been growing slightly less than that with this huge output gap. Well, if the output gap's only 5%, which I regard as something of a lower bound estimate, that means that you're going to have to grow at 3.5% to 4% for 4 or 5 years. That's a huge economic boom. That's great for business profits, public finances. So we're on the precipice, I think, of some of this finally happening. Unfortunately, we've got some new headwinds to address. And this one also follows under the heading of policy uncertainty. We know that the Fed wants to taper quantitative easing. We know because they tell us over and over and over again that it's going to be data dependent. The economy isn't strong enough, but they would sure like to stop buying $85 billion a month and expanding the balance sheet. Fed's balance sheet is now over $4 trillion. This is a pretty large hedge fund we're talking about here, $4 trillion. And they'd like to stop buying and then start to exit. This is a chart that kind of indicates what they've been doing. You see the blue line is the assets on the balance sheet. Very, very stable over a long period of time. If I were to extend that chart back, that flat line on the left-hand side would go a long ways, hardly move. Then quantitative easing 1 kicks in, and 2, an Operation Twist, and then finally the most recent version where the line started heading straight up again at a rapid pace, and it will continue to do so. Most guesses are that tapering itself won't begin probably until mid to late spring at the earliest, if the economy begins to take off. A lot of reasons behind that, but that's what the projection is at $85 billion a month. That's a lot of money, a lot of assets that they're buying. Well, normally you would think that this is textbook monetization of government debt. And if you ever took any economic history, you know that when that happens, usually you get hyperinflation. Well, inflation is very, very low. That's one of the great strengths of our economy. Well, inflation is a monetary phenomenon, and that green line is the money supply. As you can see, quantitative easing doesn't seem to have had much effect on the money supply, which is why it hasn't had much effect on interest rates. Well, why not? Well, because the Fed short-circuited this debt monetization mechanism that has bedeviled countries down through the ages. They were finally allowed, in the nick of time, for unrelated reasons. If you ever believe in providence at all applied to this country, this is it in monetary policy. The Congress finally allowed the Fed to pay interest on reserves. Seems like a small thing, an innocuous thing. Well, what it means is The Fed can buy all of these bonds, pay interest on reserves, and the banks basically in the financial markets give the Fed the bonds and take reserves in exchange. So that red line is the rise of reserves, and you see it tracks the rise in assets very well. What this means is the government is not printing money, and any time you hear that in public discussion or on one of the news channels, oh, the government is pumping money and we're all going to have hyperinflation, that's another name to remember. Don't listen to that person ever again on monetary policy. Red green line, does that look like they're pumping money? No. They're locking it all up in reserves because the Fed's policy here is not to pump up the money supply. The Fed's policy, first and foremost, is to drive down long-term interest rates, especially the mortgage rate, to help the healing in the household sector, the household balance sheet, recover labor mobility. It all follows from that. Well, unfortunately, most estimates now say that the Fed is at most pushing the mortgage rate down about 10 basis points, maybe 15. It's having an effect. Think about that. Buying $85 billion a month, and you get 10 basis points. On the other hand, if your argument is it's not doing any harm, why not? Well, we don't know if it's going to do any harm. It's not doing any harm right now. What will it do in the future? That is a huge debate, which maybe we can get into in a question and answer period. But for right now, the important story is this is what the Fed's doing, and that's what they're going to have to do. That is not a specific forecast, by the way. There's no timing, but it gives you a sense that the Fed policy will be to unload all of these bonds. Now think about it. They're buying all of these bonds in a soft market. Interest rates are already very low. Long-term rates are very low. They're buying the bonds, pushing the rates down a little bit further. The predicate for reversing this policy is the economy is stronger. Markets are healing. Interest rates are rising. Wait a minute. Interest rates are rising. And in this tightened financial market, the Fed is now going to be unloading bonds by the tens of billions on top of the federal government's regular debt financing. So whatever you think the effect of quantitative easing is on interest rates today, there's going to be a significant multiple of that on the effect of interest rates tomorrow in the opposite direction. That's called a headwind. The first headwind, of course, is figuring out what the reversal of quantitative easing actually means. If it means what I think it means higher interest rates than the economy would normally sustain. Not a higher Fed funds rate. The Fed has separated out these two policies. The traditional policy of keeping a Fed funds rate, the short-term rate at zero, that could stay at zero for a very long time. I saw the president of the Boston Fed this morning kind of offhand mentioned that maybe the Fed funds rate would stay at zero into 2016. Probably a good guess. Nobody knows, of course, and as he said, and I remind everyone, it's data dependent, but that's not a bad guess. We're talking about the long-term interest rates that are most important for the economy going up because the Fed has to unwind. So interest rates are rising as the economy recovers and now pushed even faster as the Fed exits. Another interest rate story is debt, deficits, and interest rates. This is the budget deficit. And you notice those terrible Bush budget deficits early in the 2000s. I actually got to about $300 billion, $200 billion. Well, we've had 4 years of trillion. This year got a little bit better, around the 650, 680 billion range. And it'll get a little bit better again. And then under the Congressional Budget Office forecast, it starts rising again. Rising in part because of programs like Medicare and Social Security, but rising predominantly because those rising interest rates and all the government debt that the government has issued start to get very expensive. We go from interest expense in the budget of just over $200 billion to just over $800 billion in 10 years. That's the rise in debt I'm talking about. We've stayed at 40% or below, basically for all the modern era after the Second World War. And then through all the deficit spending that we've had in the last few years, it jumped to above 70, from which it will not decline. In the lower chart, 70% of GDP, we get a small swell there, and then it begins rising. And if I were to continue that chart out with CBO's long-term forecast, it would never come down. It would continue to rise and do so at an accelerating pace. So you get higher interest rates. Crowding out has not disappeared. In this bizarre environment that we have today, you're not going to see a lot of crowding out, in part because the federal government, that is the Fed, is buying $85 billion a month, and the federal government's running a $680 billion deficit. I'll do the math. There's not a lot of new debt being added to the financial markets. But as the deficit continues to rise and the Fed starts selling those bonds back into the market, we're going to see that traditional crowding out, and this will drive interest rates up even further. Nobody knows how much, but it may be a good ballpark estimate based off of the academic research is 100 basis points. So if you thought the 10-year Treasury was going to 5.5% as markets normalized, add to that for some period of time a surcharge for Fed exit, and add to that a permanent surcharge of perhaps 100 basis points. It's not that the economy cannot overcome this. If the economy is recovering, heading towards full employment, markets are flexible, the economy will recover and continue to grow, but this is a pretty strong headwind. And then people start worrying more about the entitlement program. This is a nice graph of Social Security. Nice because it shows the good old days when it ran a surplus. Nice because it demonstrates, if you notice in the upper left-hand corner, it's a chart done by the Peterson Foundation. I could have picked a chart from any 5 or even 10 other organizations in Washington. We all use the same data. We all produce the same charts. My point about that is this is not a disputed issue. Social Security's budget deficit last year was $55 billion. When you hear a congresswoman or senator say that Social Security is not adding a penny to the deficit, they either didn't tell the truth or don't know what they're talking about, because it was $55 billion and climbing rapidly, as you can see. Never again to return to surplus. And in a very few years, the Social Security Trust Fund will simply be exhausted. So if you don't want to reform Social Security, just wait till it exhausts, and then we can reform Social Security de facto, because all your checks will be cut by about a quarter. Those are the two reforms. We're going to reform Social Security. We can either do it intelligently now, or we can wait till the trust fund runs out of money and just cut everybody's check 25%. Those are the two basic choices. As a result of the shortfall in Social Security and Medicare and other programs, debt as a share of GDP, which used to be below 40, is now above 70, will start rising through the European countries. Greece, France, so forth, all the way up to Japan levels. Now, I'll emphasize, this is what would happen under current policy as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. This will never happen. Why won't it ever happen? Because the credit markets won't stand for it. When the credit markets actually come to believe what they currently cannot conceive of, despite the warnings from Moody's and Fitch and Standard & Poor's, that this is what we currently face, when the credit markets come to believe that, in fact, Washington insists on sitting on its hands, you're going to see a new force for rising interest rates that may dwarf everything else we talked about. There's going to be tremendous force from financial markets operating through interest rates to force Washington to finally address it. And then this chart becomes what would have happened, not what did happen. Another reason why, thing we have to worry about, with all these things driving up interest rates. The interest rate is, as I said, you think about the interest rate, of course we're talking about short-term, long-term, different credit qualities. Let's bunch them all up and to talk about the interest rate. The interest rate is perhaps the single most important price in our economy. It has been artificially low for a variety of reasons by a long margin for a long time. The thing about prices is they tell people to take actions. When the interest rates were very low in the mid-2000s, the signal it was sending, and we heard it over and over, the price of risk is too low. Well, what the market heard was, yeah, you may say the price of risk is too low, but the market's telling me it's just fine, and it's telling me to take on more risk. And we did with abundance. And that led to the housing bubble and a lot of other trouble. Well, once again, the market is sending us a signal that price of risk is low, risks in the economy are low. It's misdirecting resources, nationally and internationally. We just don't necessarily know where they are. Doesn't look like a housing bubble too much in too many places in this country right now. But when you have interest rates this low, you know resources are being misdirected. Capital is being misapplied, mispriced, and we won't find out what it is until interest rates start rising again. The example I use there is of a river that's flooded, and it's been in a flood stage for a very long time. And then the river finally starts to recede. What's left on the riverbank is not pretty. It's all the stuff that got washed up, washed over, wheels and cars and license plates, you know, all the great examples. That's what we're going to see. As interest rates rise and prices adjust, we're going to see the misinvestment. And there's going to be a hit from that. We just don't know where it is. Just something to be aware of. I don't know of any way to prepare for it because by definition, it's hidden. It's malinvestment from artificially low interest rates. When these interest rates in the U.S. start rising, before they do in Europe and Japan especially, because we're a bit ahead of them in the recovery curve, there's going to be an exchange rate effect, and it will be profound. The dollar is going to get very strong. Now, if you're a strong dollar type, if you're like my good friend Larry Kudlow, who thinks a strong dollar is the greatest thing because it's almost an expression of your national virility, then you're going to love this. The dollar's going to get really strong. If you're exporting, it's not so great. If you're competing with importers, it's not so great. So in a trade sense, this is a headwind we're going to have to deal with. There's pluses to a strong dollar. A lot of commodities, especially oil, priced in dollars. When the dollar goes up, oil is it's priced in dollars, but it's held to a worldwide standard. The price of oil in dollar terms will go down, so energy prices will fall. It's not all negative, but it's an issue. One of the consequences, now move to the international side, one of the consequences of a rising dollar, and we saw this back in June, a lot of countries around the world have been doing reasonably well. They sure look like they're being propped up by the monetary policies of the U.S., Europe, Japan, and England. But for whatever reason, a lot of these currencies are being heavily influenced by current Fed policy. Fed starts to reverse, the dollar starts rising, their currencies start plunging, and we saw crises in countries like India and Brazil when their currencies started to plunge. Why is that a big problem? Well, their external debts are in dollars. So suddenly the real debt cost for these countries is soaring, and the countries themselves are not in very good shape. They've got large trade deficits, large budget deficits, and rising inflation, and have been not doing a lot to correct their own economies for quite some time because they've lived off of either rising energy prices or monetary policies. India and Brazil are two great cases for that. Another threat, and this one is a different nature, is China. And I don't mean China a threat in a military sense or a hegemonic sense in Asia, but rather it's a poor country that's getting very large, growing very rapidly. You say, well, if it's growing so rapidly, why is it a problem? And when they have a bad year, their growth is 3 times ours on a good year. Well, the problem in China is it starts off with so much of what happens in China is not transparent even to the Chinese. You have recently a huge surge in private credit and government credit, especially at the state and local level, not at the federal level. State and local level, huge increase in credit. One estimate has it over 2% of GDP now. Well, that's not necessarily bad if you're doing good things with the money. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's buying infrastructure that doesn't seem to have a lot of use. So you've got this huge expansion of credit in a non-transparent way. It's not in the banking sector. The banks will be influenced by it secondarily, but it's by the wealth management funds and the local government funding vehicles that all interact with each other. And the problem is can't really get our hands on what's happening. The IMF issues a report once a year called the Article 4 analysis. It does that of all major countries. It's really irritating when they do it with the U.S. So why are you looking at us? Well, we have to. We're required to. They looked at China, and they raised a lot of red flags about the Chinese credit markets and debt levels. And immediately thereafter, the State Council, which is the Chinese equivalent of our cabinet, basically told the accountants in China, stop whatever you're doing, find a wealth fund or a bank, and go audit their books. So they took it seriously. There's an entity in China called the China Development Bank. It's not a commercial bank, it's more like an investment bank. It is state-run. It is an arm of the state, one of the biggest, most powerful banks in the world, and when you look at it, it looks like Fannie and Freddie on steroids without the limitation of operating in the housing sector. They operate everywhere. Now, they operate in a very hands-on way, but the amount of credit that they have issued directly and through local funding vehicles is enormous, and again, nobody really knows where all the interconnections are. And there is no test, there's no market test for others to observe whether or not these are wise investments, whether you really need that 8th lane on that highway going from one city to another, whether you really need that Manhattan you're building out in the middle of nowhere. Literally, they're building a copy of Manhattan out in the middle of nowhere. It all shows up in GDP because GDP measures investment, and this is all investment. If you build a building and knock it down, that counts GDP twice, once when you build it and once when you knock it down. If you build it again, you can't get to count it again. The problem is you have to finance that, and that means you need income. So China is a threat, in my mind, primarily because there's a lot going on there. It's a terribly important economy, and we don't understand it, and they don't either. Now, it may work fine. The Chinese government has done a masterful job of managing their economy, and you almost want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but there's a lot of warning signals here. And the last headline I want to mention is Europe. Europe may seem like it's dropped off the radar screen. Well, in a sense it did. About a year ago, the European intelligentsia, the elites, the European Union, and so forth, said, we can't do anything to solve our problems without Germany. Germany is the linchpin to everything. Germany's about to have an election. We're going to agree not to really do anything for the next year. And when Merkel gets reelected, if she does, then she's ready to move, and then we'll go. So you've had a pause button, so there's a reason it's been quiet. Europe hit a pause button for almost a year. Well, the election was last September. She's putting her coalition together. It's about time to start getting busy. Now, they have done some technical things, working on technical rules for a banking union, working on making sure there's no financial transaction tax, although France continues to push one. So it's not that they've done nothing, but most of what they've done has been below the surface. Now it's time to get real again. They still have debt limits that are unsustainable, simply cannot be paid off in many of the peripheral countries, in which they have continually contracting economies. So even if they are running a balanced budget, as Italy is basically doing today, the debt to GDP ratio continues to rise because the denominator continues to shrink. So the debt to GDP ratio in these countries, which is unsustainable, continues to rise. They have high unemployment and almost no hope for it getting any better. Their hope is to stabilize and stop contracting in their economies, not to deal with 22% unemployment. How long can they continue that? That's a political question. Personally, I've been amazed that they've been able to go with this long. I did not believe for a minute that Europe politically could hold together with unemployment rates above 20% in a great many, not always the most stable countries in the world, and hold it all together, but they've done that. How long can they do it? I don't know. But they have a structure which is out of balance. They've got debt levels they can't pay off. They've got unemployment in non-growing markets, and they have not made the structural changes necessarily, especially in labor markets, to gain the flexibility I was talking about that we have that they don't. And above all, they have a currency in the euro. I have nothing against the euro, but the experiment didn't work. It was supposed to lead to convergence, it led to divergence. Instead of converging, the countries that were weak borrowed so they could enjoy the benefits of being in the eurozone, but they didn't make the reforms and the improvements in productivity necessary, and they still haven't. And so now they're trying to adjust through high unemployment, driving wages down. It's not working. So you still have a euro that doesn't work, which was at the center of the problem at the beginning. So you have debt levels you can't deal with, you have high unemployment you can't correct, and you still have a currency union that's malformed. This week, one of the original drivers of the euro, the original designers, basically said to save the European project, which is the collectivization of Europe, to save the European project, we have to get rid of the euro. That's his judgment. I think it probably is sound because the alternative simply doesn't exist. What does this mean for us? Why is this a headwind? It's just interesting that all these things are going on in Europe. Well, it used to be interesting, a major headwind for us 2 years ago because we hadn't had a chance to really think through all that happens when a major currency like the euro breaks up. Well, maybe it breaks up into two pieces. That's for Europe to decide what would happen. But nobody really understood what this would mean for financial markets. Now we think we've got that handle on that. But it's going to be a rough time for Europe when this happens. Whether it's the north or the south, there's going to be a real shock. And once again, export markets are key. One of our key export markets is in tough times, and it's not going to be getting better, and it could be getting worse in the next few years. That counts as a major headwind. So this is a basic forecast of what the economy would look going forward. If we continue to go on as we are, this is a CBO forecast, we'd close some of the output gap, and then we would grow. If the output gap is more like the 5% that I think it is, you have that extended period of growth. And that would be the kind of thing that you hang your hat on. That's the kind of boom that would be reminiscent of the Clinton boom years. And if the output gap is even longer, once we start getting some momentum and closing it, this economy is powerful. It will blow through headwinds, it will continue to grow rapidly, and that's the kind of thing they write about in textbooks. The once in many generations kind of growth. On the other hand, if the headwinds hit first, you might have something like that. That you don't want to see. When it all nets out, with the headwinds and the recovering forces, I think that's where we end up. A decent recovery, way too late, and we really need to remind ourselves that the nature of our economy is to recover. The reason it hasn't, some of it has to do with recession and recovering forces, but overwhelmingly, the thing that's holding us back today is Washington. The policies that Washington has put in place, the uncertainty that they're imposing, and going forward, the uncertainty that we can't do anything about now, which is the Fed unwinding. Those things are going to be holding us back and have held us back. And I think we ought to be a little mad about it. As businesses, you should be doing much better in our economy, but you can't all by yourself. The whole economy has to lift up. But it isn't. And if we have a chance, I think we'll recover and start to accelerate. And the red bar to the right of that one should be much higher going forward. The question is all in the timing. What hits first, the recovery forces or the headwinds? So with that, let me stop going on and turn to whatever questions you might have, especially about Washington, which I know a fair amount about.